Reserve was introduced into EFT with patch 0.12, a very momentous occasion for the game, as it was the first time Tarkov began its insane growth period of popularity, from a smaller, more niche experience that was only known for its level of difficulty and obscurity, to something much more known to anyone that simply enjoys video games. Combine this patch with the first ever Twitch Drops event for Tarkov, and you have monumental growth, the likes of which we hadn't seen before. Reserve at the time was the newest map to be added into the game, and I can only speak for myself, but when it was first added, I found the map to be easily the most challenging map in the game, excluding labs of course. With its obtuse square design and the lack of any real sense of direction I should be going to reach in extraction, it plays very differently from most other maps in the game. Something like customs or even interchange makes sense. You spawn on one side and you need to work your way to the other. Reserve doesn't really work like that because its extractions are so different. The train and the hermetic door were the only two guaranteed ways of escaping if you didn't have a red rebel, and for a while it stayed that way. Until one patch where BSG decided to add a brand new entire underground bunker area beneath the already existing map. It was kind of mind-boggling when people first discovered it, and while that part of the map is insanely cool and honestly stressful, as time went on, I found that people more often than not just end up underground, ignoring most of the map up top. Of course, early on, this isn't the case. People still need to complete quests and the like, but all that does beg a question. Does D2's existence somewhat sour playing Reserve as a whole? Before D2 was added to Reserve, I mentioned earlier how, for me personally, it was the hardest map to generally play on when it was brand new. The unusual square design made it so that there wasn't a single point of interest you were working towards in regards of an extraction. Assuming you don't have a Red Rebel and Paracord, your options were the manhole extract, but that requires you to sacrifice your backpack and any goodies you've looted, hermetic door, which requires you to not only press a button that alerts the entire map that you're going for extract, or the train, which requires you to survive until about the last 16 to 12 minutes of the raid for the train to pull up. Even to this day, Reserve is a challenging map that makes you think about it much differently than most other locations. Reserve itself is a military base with tons of buildings and bunkers to navigate around, but if you're not in a building or going from one to another, you're very exposed to the elements around you, on top of one of the best sniping locations in the entire game being on this map, even if it is kind of obvious. In a similar vein to Streets of Tarkov, I feel very exposed when I'm not in a building, or at the very least have some walls or windows around me granting some level of safety. Being out in the open is asking for trouble, and that's ironically the strongest trait about Reserve, making the player feel vulnerable and having them map out a route in their head as to how they will work around the map, getting close to an extract, and then executing that plan to hopefully survive. The safest place before D2 was the underground parking garage. I use the word safe loosely because that is a spawn point for the boss Gluhar and his goons to cause problems, but at least you aren't going to get dropped from dome by a sniper. However, once D2 was added, the entire dynamic of the map changed, and it feels like for the worse. D2 is an entire underground section that connects many of the buildings on the east side of the map. The Pawn Buildings, White Bishop, and Black Queen all have basements that connect to the underground in the new D2 extract, which you need to flip a power switch on before it will work. The first time I went down there, it was pretty much an accident. I had no idea it even existed and fumbled my way around, getting lost until I luckily just found the D2 extract with the power on from someone else hitting the switch. I got tremendously lucky, but the entire time I was stressed. There were so many long hallways, areas to set up an ambush for somebody, and I think that was initially D2's strongest trait. The unfamiliar environment is something that not only benefited D2, but every map or expansion that's been introduced into EFT. Knowledge is power in this game, and when the player is stripped of that information, fear, actual fear, kicks in because you don't know where you are going, what's going to happen, or if there are enemies around you. Of course, it's unfair to say that's the only thing D2 does well, because those experiences are only achievable a couple of times before the player begins to understand the space around them. What D2 also does well is the level of counterplay and flanking opportunities it has. With everything being connected, you are never in a location where you can't reposition and find new footing to take advantage of. You can push forward, retreat and go around to many other tunnels, or even run back up above ground and re-enter from a new building. The possibilities are kind of endless depending on your circumstances. It makes fighting when it does happen down there incredibly interesting if you remember to make use of all the different angles and hallways you can approach from. And while this level of interconnectivity is awesome, it does come with one flaw. D2 is pretty much only where PvP fights occur now. Not because D2 is bad, but quite the opposite. It's actually designed very well. Too well, in fact. It almost feels like a mini labs in regards to how much every hallway and staircase flows into each other, how much freedom you have to maneuver and outplay other PMCs. It's incredible once you get good at it. Reserve before was interesting because there were so many buildings with multiple stories and windows to get angles from. Most locations could scan a decent chunk of the map if you were at a high enough elevation in any particular building. It was a much more slow and methodical kind of PvP, where it wasn't about who had better reaction speeds or better aim, but instead who had the better position. The entire dynamic of the map shifted with D2. The above ground parts of the map can feel devoid of any engagement if there are no scavs spawning. It can feel vast and empty. And while for completing quests, that's a great thing, ultimately if there are huge dead zones across a map because another part is being used more often, that is cause for some level of concern. Some people might say that D2 existing is a good thing for the map, because it was so difficult to run around as a player. Having a Thunderdome that attracts a chunk of the PMCs on the map into a hot zone takes some of the pressure away from other areas, allowing people to walk around where they were unable to previously. And there is definitely an argument to be had that D2 existing makes the map easier to play. My only problem with that isn't even with D2 at that point, but with the spawns. Reserve does have some atrocious spawns, whereby just looking either left or right, you have the chance of seeing another PMC running desperately for cover before having their head blown off. What makes this worse is that because entry points into D2 are only on the eastern part of the map, if you get a spawn by the main train station, you're gonna be late to that party. D2 being as good as it is means people are fighting less above ground, and that kind of sucks. Reserve, again, shares some small similarities with Streets in that being able to start a fight with a player in one building and then reposition into another for a takedown, and will actually have you really thinking on the fly about how to approach this circumstance. Not saying you won't be able to do that in D2, but how you have to critically think about your movement is different versus when you are underground. So, is Reserve worse off with D2 existing on the map? Well, all things considered, I would generally say no. Having one more extraction that is basically gimmickless, allowing people to fight in a more concentrated area whilst combating scavs and even raiders sometimes, gives the map an extra layer of depth that it didn't necessarily need, but is most welcome. However, there are some sticking points with D2 existing that do have to be acknowledged. People can fight down there, but if everyone is fighting down there, it makes most of the other parts of the map moot. It's a paradise for people who want to extract camp because it's all just long, narrow hallways. It might be the most camped extract in the game next to Emercon on Interchange, and it's certainly not perfect, but it's one of the most unique and interesting experiences BSG has done for any map, and it's not even close. Thank you very much for taking the time out of your day to watch this video. Let me know down in the comment section below your thoughts on D2, whether it's good or bad for Reserve as a whole, and be sure to subscribe for more videos about different parts and expansions on maps that may or may not make them play worse. I hope to see you in future ones.